and welcome to the City of Longview Community Development Division's fiscal year 2020-2021 CDBG grant subrecipient training. This meeting is to educate any and all subrecipient potentials for the Community Development Block Grant funds of all of the necessary administrative and statutory requirements for becoming a grantee under this program. This program will discuss individual contractual obligations and statutory requirements as listed under 24 CFR Part 570, subparts J and K. I'd like to let everyone know that goes to apply each year that this link right here, Playing by the Rules Handbook, is the ultimate guide to applying for Community Development Block Grant funds. Everything that we go over today and more will be described in much more concise and accurate terms, whether it's going from picking a national objective to understanding how your organization's part could be fulfilled within a grant under this program. Also, a copy of this presentation, along with any and all reference materials, will be sent out at the conclusion of this meeting, along with the eventual application link. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and go on to the next slide. Community Development Block Grant Programs Guidelines. We're going to go through everything from head to toe on what you need to have to apply for this grant today. So bear with me. We do have a lot of definitional content, but we'll sail on through it and get to a short Q&A session at the end. Community Development Block Grant funds are given on a formulaic basis to all cities with a population over 50,000. The amount received is based on the number of census tracts having a large portion of low to moderate income households. These tracts are updated with census information on a regular basis. The grant is given to meet 3 national objectives set out in the Community Development Act. The national objectives are activities or programs that 1, benefit low to moderate income persons, 2, address the slum and blight, 3, meet a particularly urgent community development need, such as funds to address national disaster. Eligibility requirements. To determine if a project is eligible, it must pass 7 basic steps. It must be an eligible activity as defined by the statute, must be either a new service or a quantifiable increase in the level of an existing service. This requirement does not prevent refunding the CDBG assisted public service at the same level in a subsequent year. 3, it must meet a category within the eligible activity. 4, must meet a national objective. 5, must be used for the overall benefit to low to moderate income persons. 6, it must meet a cost reasonableness guidelines as set forth by the federal government. And 7, it must meet environmental review requirements. Organizational requirements. All organizations participating in the CDBG program as a subrecipient must 1, possess a nonprofit charter issued by the state of Texas. 2, possess 501c3 tax exemption service as required by the Internal Revenue Service. 3, possess the current financial audit for the previous program year. If your organization expended $750,000 or more in a federal money, you must submit an A-133 audit. Financial management components for managing federal funds. All right, so we have 8 steps underneath this. First is internal controls. Does your agency have a written set of policies and procedures that define staff qualifications, duties, lines of authority, separation of functions, and access to assets and sensitive documents? 2, accounting records. Does your agency maintain adequate financial accounting systems, the basic elements of which should include, well, A, a chart of accounts, B, general ledger, C, cash receipts journal, D, cash disbursements journal, E, a payroll journal, F, payable and receivable ledgers, and G, job cost journals, if any are involved in a construction. Three, allowable costs. Does your agency clearly define set of standards and procedures for determining the reasonableness to allowability and allocable cost incurred that's consistent with the basic federal rules? Next section. Continuing on, 4, source documentation. Does your agency maintain up-to-date files of original source documentation, including receipts, invoices, canceled checks, etc., for all of your financial transactions, including or involving obligations incurred in the use of the CDBG program income? 5, budget controls. Does your agency maintain up-to-date approved budget for all funded activities and perform comparison of that budget with the actual expenditures for each budgetary category? 6, cash management. Does your agency have a regular procedure for accurately projecting the cash needs of the organization that will serve to minimize the time between the receipt of funds from the grantee and their actual disbursement? And finally, the last section under financial management, 7, financial reporting. Is your agency able to provide accurate, current, and complete disclosure of the financial results of federally sponsored project or program in accordance with the reporting requirements of the grantee and HUD? And 8, audit. When was your last independent public accountant audit, and when were the results? Does your agency have a copy of that management letter? Once again, any and all of these sections will be defined in greater detail within the document playing by the rules that was listed at the very beginning. So if you have any sort of pertinent detail-oriented questions, check with that once we send out the link for that document and consult with that, and we can answer them if they're definitional in quality. Next, we'll move on to our procurement guidelines. Now, we have 2 sections on this. Requirements for using federal funds to purchase materials, products, or services under the CDBG entitlement program. Must follow a free and open competitive process in securing those products or service. Must be properly documented for your purchasing activities and decisions. Observe the special rules for particular kinds of purchases regarding small purchases, competitive sealed bids, competitive proposals, and sole source procurement. Properly bond and insure work involving large construction contracts or subcontracts. Use local business and contract with small minority or women-owned businesses to maximum extent feasible. We also have some links regarding our procurement rules. Since this is a federal program that's administered through our local city, we will follow both the City of Longview procurement guidelines, which defer back to the state guidelines, and also, depending on the type of project that's implemented, federal procurement guidelines, all of which will be in agreement and will refer back to Section 3 and Davis-Bacon requirements as needed. There are going to be both links for these available at the conclusion of the presentation, and we will check any and all potential contractors and or subrecipients within the National Department Registry on SAMS.gov. Management and disposition of property. We have a couple of different property definitions that can be included under the application. First, that of which is real property, which means land including improvements to and structures located on the land, but excluding any movable machinery or equipment. Personal property is basically any kind of property other than real property and can be tangible, such as supplies, furniture, and equipment. Further distinctions can be made between dividing it into non-expendable personal property and expendable personal property. Non-expendable personal property, which generally is considered to include tangible property having useful life of more than 1 year and is at an acquisition cost of more than $300 per unit. Expendable personal property, which includes tangible property and other non-expendable personal property. Next, moving on to real property. The subrecipient agreement must be explicit about the use of any real property under the subrecipient's control that was acquired, improved in whole or in part with CDBG funds in excess of $25,000. For such instances, as referred to 24 CFR 570.503B-7, mandates that any such property be either must be used by the subrecipient to continue to meet one of the CDBG's program national objectives for at least 5 years after the expiration of the subrecipient agreement, or a longer time as specified by the grantee in the subrecipient agreement. Or if a national objective is not met during this time period, grantee must be reimbursed for the current and fair market value of any portion of the value attributable to non-CDBG funds. So essentially, this is referring to any sort of improvement that could be made within the CDBG grant. As you are completing your application, please be mindful of these definitional separations of what is going to be considered, because if it falls under the qualification of real property or any of the other definitions below, they will be subject to those definitions' individual regulations, such as explained previously. Personal property. Got three main sections to cover on this: personal property and equipment for nonprofit subrecipients. The title to personal property acquired with CDBG funds is vested within the subrecipient, subject to the following conditions. One, in all cases in which personal property is no longer needed by the subrecipient for CDBG activities, it must be transferred to the grantee for the CDBG program, or can be retained for the subrecipient after the completion of to the grantee. Two, the grantee may reserve the right to transfer the title of the equipment to the federal government or a third party. Three, in all cases in which personal property is sold, the proceeds will be considered program income. Moving on to the next section of personal property. The residual inventory of unused supplies exceeding $5,000 not needed by the subrecipient for CDBG activities must be transferred to the grantee for the CDBG program, or can be retained after compensating the grantee. Next, in all cases in which the residual inventory of supplies is sold, the proceeds are considered program income. And continuing on to the last slide in this section, the federal government reserves all royalty-free, non-exclusive, irrevocable licenses to reproduce, publish, or otherwise use and authorize others to use for federal government purposes the copyright to any work developed under CDBG funds, any rights of copyright which could be a subrecipient, which a subrecipient or contractor purchases with CDBG support. Moving on to record keeping. We've talked about a little bit within the financial section of this presentation. Moving further, the administrative records are files and records that apply to the overall administration of the subrecipient CDBG activities. Financial records include a chart of accounts, manual on accounting procedures, accounting journals, ledgers, source documentation, procurement files, bank account records, financial reports, audit files, and more. Project case files are documents that document the activities undertaken within respect to the specific individual beneficiaries, property owners, and/or properties. And quarterly reports will be required no later than 10 days after each quarter. Pay requests may be submitted quarterly or monthly. These are going to be individual requirements that are placed on each grantee, potentially or recurring. Grantees for this program, the quarterly reports help dictate how much progress has been made between each quarter that we have. That way we can document that, report it back to HUD, and ensure that we can have a continuation of grant funds in the future. Other administrative program requirements include program income, any gross income received by the subrecipient that was directly generated from the use of CDBG funds, programmatic and budget changes, subrecipient agreements, and/or the grantee's written policies must specify when prior approval of the grantee is necessary for programmatic or budgetary changes relative to the subrecipient's CDBG funded activities. We're also subject to civil rights, fair housing, employment, and other federal statutes on contracting opportunities. The subrecipient agreement must require that the subrecipient administer its CDBG funds in compliance with the following federal laws and executive orders and implementation regulations. Also, every project has to pass an environmental review requirement. No party involved with the project, including subrecipients, may commit funds to a project, including incurring project costs, until the grantee completes the appropriate environmental review and public notification process, and HUD approves the certification of compliance with the environmental laws and a request for a release of funds from the environmental condition. Each project is also subject to the historic preservation statute. Under each project, we will consult with the state historic preservation officer to whether a potential affected property is or could be declared a historic property, is located within a historic district or area that could be declared a historic district, involves proposed changes that could adversely affect historic properties or neighborhoods, or properties and neighborhoods that could be declared as historic. We're also subject to OSHA, EPA, and HUD rules concerning lead-based paint. Certain requirements apply the use of CDBG funds for the rehabilitation of residential property that was constructed before 1978. And we also have a very strict conflict of interest policy. There are two sets of conflicts of interest provisions applicable to activities carried out with CDBG funding. The first set is applicable to the procurement of goods and services by subrecipients, which can be found within the 24 CFR 84.42 and 85.36. The second is a provision that can be found within 24 CFR 576.11a-2. These provisions cover situations not covered by either of the previous listed sections. And suspension and termination. When the problems arise in the performance of a subrecipient's grantee, the grantee is responsible for taking the appropriate actions for correcting these deficiencies, including suspending or terminating the CDBG activities being carried out by the subrecipient. Audits and monitoring. Since all of these projects are done with federal funding, we've listed the individual requirements that will be placed on each subgrantee if awarded. The audits and monitoring section is to let any potential applicants and or recurring applicants that we will be monitoring those individual documents at various times throughout the year. And that also that we as the Community Development Division do subject ourselves to an internal city audit / monitoring each year, and a federal monitoring whenever it is deemed necessary by our regional advisors within Fort Worth. A grantee is responsible for ensuring that all CDBG funds under its oversight are used in accordance with all program requirements and for determining the adequacy of its subrecipient's performance. Accordingly, the grantee is empowered to make site visits and review program files as necessary to fulfill these responsibilities. Now the part that you've all been waiting for, the application. How are we going to get access to the CDBG / home applications this year? At the conclusion of this meeting, we'll be sent a list of email addresses of those that attended yesterday and those that have attended today. We will compile those email addresses and hopefully get the link sent out either this evening or first thing Monday morning. So that being said, it's fairly simple. You'll take the link that is provided within the email that we send to you, go to this site right here, Neighborly Software, and register your email address and password, which time there will be a dashboard screen that will pop up and give you the option to select one of our mini grants that is listed within there. You'll click the CDBG option, and from there, there are 7 steps within the application, along with supplemental documentation requirements that will need to be provided. But the wonderful thing about this application is that it will not let you turn it in until it is absolutely complete. So if you have any questions, They will have a link to their support website at support@neighborlysoftware.com, to which any sort of technical issues can be resolved from there. But at the point in which you receive the grant application link, no further questions outside of definitional determinations cannot be answered by me, the grantor, as it is a federally competitive process. Next, what does our timeline look like? Yesterday was our first subrecipient meeting. Today is the second one. So at this point, there are no further subrecipient meetings. And so on Monday, March 8th, the application period will begin. And on April the 2nd, the application period will end, at which point we will review them internally and pass along recommendations to our committee. And after that point, we will go through normal means process of reaching out to all those that have applied, letting them know their status, and the typical funding cycle within the City of Longview budgetary process will ensue, at which point on October 1st, at the beginning of the new fiscal year, funds will be available for use. And now, much anticipated point of question and answer. I have my contact info listed above. So if you would like to reach out before we send out the grant applications or any specific questions not noted here, please do, and I can answer those before we go live on Monday. Outside of that, Richard, do we have anybody interested in raising their hand?
Well, we do have the one attendee. She is not indicating at this time that she wishes to speak with a raised hand in the application software. We can give her a second. Again, you can click your button to raise your hand in the application software if you would like to ask a question, and we'll unmute you. And Dakota, there's no indication she has a question at this time.
Okay. Thank you, everybody, for coming out. And at this point, we will conclude the second application meeting for the 2021 CDBG and Home Fund.